Emily Baker threw back a naughty lock of hair from her neat office hairdo, a tall bun with hair smoothly arranged around it. The girl made the last strokes on the documents and drew up another insurance contract, providing for the payment of considerable sum for the Mercedes that had been wrecked in a car accident. Emily worked as an insurance agent in the company called Feldman and Partners. She drew up certificates for monetary compensation and dealt with complicated insurance cases involving the valuable property. The girl loved this job. She really valued her position, and there were a number of good reasons for that. Emily grew up in the provinces, in a remote village. There was not much work there, and she did not want to work on farm, where her kind-hearted relatives offered her a job. Salaries on the farm were next to nothing, and barely enough to scrape by. But the owner's son, a desperate reveler and drunkard, was constantly pestering the girl. At first, Emily honestly tried to ignore his antics, but one day, he allowed himself to go too far. And that was the last straw that prompted the young and ambitious girl to make a difficult decision. After collecting her simple belongings, Emily said goodbye to her aunt and uncle who raised her. The girl's parents died before she was 7 and went to look for happiness in the big city. However, despite the fact that Emily had a technical school behind her and a law degree, no one wanted to take her a serious job in the capital. At most, they offered her a job as a cleaning lady or a salesperson in a hypermarket. Of course, Emily did not agree to such situation and saved everything to stay in the city longer and to find her dream job. After a few months, the girl finally got a good fortune. She was hired as an insurance agent in a prestigious company, but on the condition that she would continue her studies next year. She would enroll in the law department of a serious institute. Emily had been working at the company for more than 6 months, and at the same time, she was preparing for the university, especially since she wanted to improve her own professional level. The money she received from her work was enough for a decent rented apartment where Emily spent long summer evenings preparing for the upcoming exams. She lived alone because she had no time for boyfriends. The rhythm of the work week was just cosmic at times. Boyfriends were out of the question. However, deep in her heart, Millie, as her colleagues call her, dreamed of meeting her true love someday. As a specialist, Emily Baker has always been highly efficient and precise in her business operations, and her natural modesty only added extra points in the eyes of her superiors. Feldman and Partners found their best employees worth weight in gold. During the entire period of her work, her superiors have never had any critical notes for Baker, and everything would have gone on just fine if one fateful day wouldn't come and completely undo all the girl's past merits. That morning, Emily was unexpectedly summoned by the firm's director, Benedict Feldman himself. This was very rare for the company. The director would usually assign his deputy to handle matters with the employees or directly to the personnel manager if things were very bad. But here, out of the blue, he decided to talk Emily personally. Why would that be? The girl pondered worriedly, standing in front of the door of the firm owner's office. Well, Baker, come in, have a seat, and tell me about the stunt you pulled with the paperwork on the last insurance deal, the director said right off the bat as soon as Emily walked in. What do you mean, Mr. Feldman? Emily let it out of her mouth, cold with inexplicably bad feeling. What stunt? I didn't cheat anyone. Is that how it is? Feldman began to rage. Do you want me to show you the accounts? Or should we call the police right away? The girl barely asked again, stammering at every syllable. She had no idea what she was being accused of. Don't play dumb with me. An innocent sheep, you see? It seemed that Benedict Feldman had lost his patience completely, and now he was about to burst with anger. His stern face turned so red. You shouldn't lead me astray. Baker, you managed to bilk the firm for $50,000. Just think, $50,000. You taking out an insurance claim on this Bradley, but the claim is fake. Well, don't you say anything, Baker? Ashamed? Did you think you wouldn't be caught? Just then, Emily seemed to begin to understand what was going on. The other day, she was taking out insurance for a client, but everything was clean there, or not. In short, Baker, the damage caused to the company through your fault theory is more than $50,000. And that's not even talking about our damaged reputation. You should have been sued at all. In general, I will be forced to collect this money from you. Unless, of course, you want to end up in jail. Emily was absolutely crushed. But Mr. Feldman, where am I going to get that kind of money? she asked the director with her voice trembling with tears. Now that's not my problem. You should have thought earlier, Mrs. Baker. Feldman's stern face expressed only cold hostility. The girl realized that there was no sympathy to be expected from the director. He did not care at all about Emily's feelings, as well as the fact that she was innocent of what had happened. There must be some mistake. The young insurer tried to justify herself. I advise you not to delay in returning the money, my dear. It would be best if you return everything in a week. Then at least I would not have to embarrass myself even more by involving the police in the case. God forbid the journalist to get wind of it. It would be such a scandal. Benedict Feldman muttered under his breath, turning away from Emily. He let her know with a gesture that the conversation was over, and she could leave the office. Emily silently slipped out the door, wiping away her tears, which had completely covered the collar of her light shirt by that time. She simply had no idea where she could get this 50,000. Such a sum was absolutely unaffordable for the girl. On the way home, she kept turning the events of that ill-fated day in her head, trying to remember the process of insurance, transaction, and the client himself. Gradually, she managed to build some logical chains and remember details that she had not given due consideration to before. As Emily later realized, this was what had failed her, so she was accused of theft. But the girl knew for a fact that she had done nothing wrong. She just performed her direct duties without violating her filling protocol. Where then had a mistake crept in that now risked ruining her whole life? Reflecting, Emily mentally returned to the day when Dean Bradley, that client, appeared in the doorway of the insurance office. Baker remembered that the man looked very presentable. Expensive beige suit, leather shoes, gold watch, and neat haircut. In a word, a classic businessman. Emily was not embarrassed that he walked straight through the lobby and sat down at her desk. At the same moment, the deputy head of the insurance company, Owen Moore, appeared at the opposite end of the office. When he saw Emily's respectable client, he immediately gave the girl the sign to immediately start drawing up the insurance claim. As far as Emily remembered, the case involved a burnt country house insured by Bradley for a very considerable sum, exactly $50,500. The girl asked her client to wait while she went to Moore's office, as she knew that throughout examinations of all the circumstances of the fire must be made in such situations. It was necessary to establish the cause of the fire and to check many different factors that could affect the insurance in the most unexpected ways. Moore, on the other hand, was sure he was right, and he was able to convince the girl of that. Don't worry, Millie. I checked all the documents personally. I went to the place together with the specialist. Everything is clean, I assure you. It's a pity about the house. It's such a beauty that burned down. The deputy was eloquent, and so, reassured by his words, Emily believed him and arranged for the insurance payment to be made to Bradley on the same day. It was also the fact that shortly before this whole story, there was a very warm and even reverent relationship between the girl and her deputy. A month ago, Owen suddenly began to pay increased attention to Emily. He gave her flowers and small gifts, paid compliments, and even walked her home a couple of times. Of course, the young provincial girl was over the moon. The capital man shows her signs of attention and apparently was very serious. The naive girl's heart almost melted. In addition, Moore began to monitor her work particularly closely, helped her solve complicated cases, and in general began to portray himself as a kind of personal patron. Alas, it all ended immediately. After the registration of the strange insurance, first the deputy began to behave a little aloof with the girl, stopped responding to her request for help with this or that case, and right after the scandal, he pretended to not know her at all. When Emily approached him to ask about the reasons for such behavior, he sharply recoiled from the girl, as if she was sick with some incurable disease. Now Emily understood that the waning interest from Owen Moore and accusing her of the theft were directly related to each other. It made her feel even worse. Stopping in the middle of the road, Millie sobbed sorrowfully. Suddenly, the girl's attention was drawn to a pitiful dog howl, followed by the sound of gunfire and the cackling laughter of men. Emily walked to the next yard, from which the men's voices were heard. To her surprise, in front of the small playground, there was an expensive sports car, and next to it, laughing nastily, 5 rich and spoiled guys were having fun. They were trying to shoot a stray dog with a traumatic gun. The poor animal was cornered, and the rascals had already fired several bullets into it, but the dog managed to dodge and now whimpered. Not knowing what else to do to escape from this wild ambush, Emily put her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. She knew that the rich bastards were going to kill the poor animal. Then the vague, dark silhouette appeared from the basement of the house, and in a second, a tall guy appeared between the dog and the guys. He was tall indeed, but very thin, and tried to drive the rich guys, who had gone too far, away from the whining four-legged victim. "What, you want a stray bullet too, asshole?" the most insolent of guys asked, cackling. Apparently, he was their ringleader. "I don't feel sorry for you, the homeless, or that mutt. I'll waste them both. The world would be a cleaner place without people like you. Ain't that right, guys?" he asked his accomplices. They all nodded uncertainly. Killing a stray dog was one thing, but shooting a man? "That's it. I'm going to act as a forest sanitarian now," the rich guy boasted, pointing his gun at the tramp and the dog. "Put the gun on the ground, quick!" Emily could not stand what was happening and dialed the phone number of the nearest police station. She deliberately put the conversation on speakerphone to influence the hooligans. "I've called the police. They'll be here in 5 minutes," the girl shouted in the face of a ringleader with the gun. "Either you get out of here and leave them alone, or you spend the next 15 days cleaning monuments in the city park." Scared of trouble with the law, the rich bastards hurried away, jumping quickly into their sports car. A moment later, the deafening scratch of drifting tires cut through the cool evening air. As soon as the yard was empty, the girl decided to turn to the homeless guy. "Oh my god, are you okay? Thank you for sticking up for the dog. I was so scared. I thought it was the end." "No way, thank you." The guy thanked her in return. "I've loved animals since I was a kid. I had a dog myself. I was about to go to bed when I heard first the barking and then the gunshots." "And you are the brave girl. If you could stand up for a tramp and a homeless dog. My name is Mason, by the way." "Emily," the girl introduced herself embarrassedly. "Oh, what are we standing here for? Let's go to my place and have some tea, and I will find something for your fluffy friend too." Mason happily agreed. Emily cooked some meal for the guy and gave the dog the rest of her chicken stew. Anyway, the girl had lost her appetite because of what had happened. The young people got to talking, and Millie learned that Mason was an orphan. His mother had died when the boy was 12, and his stepfather had taken advantage of the situation and took over their home. He threw the stepson out into the streets in the most shameless way. Since then, Mason has been wandering in the basements and heating pipes, depending on where it was more or less comfortable. Now he is about 20, and he still hopes that he can still achieve something in his life. Emily was very sympathetic to his situation, and she let Mason to bath in her bathroom and stay the night. They left the dog in the hallway, having washed his paws beforehand. Then they spent some more time together, and the longer the boy and the girl talked, the more they felt an invisible connection forming between them. Their mutual sympathy grew in proportion to the time they spent together. "You know what, Mason?" Emily said suddenly. "Maybe I'll be sleeping in basements with you soon." "Why is that?" The guy frowned. The girl shared her misfortune with him. Mason was quite surprised. He knew very well that Emily had been set up, but who had done it? "Do you still have the address of the house that supposedly burned down?" the guy asked. He decided to help his new friend, especially since no one would expect a trick from an ordinary homeless man. Emily searched through the papers, found the address, and hesitantly handed it to Mason. "Just be careful," she asked him. "We don't know what kind of people we're dealing with." The next day, having assured the girl that he would be alright, Mason went to the very village where the fire had occurred. The young man did indeed find the burned house, but it was far from the luxurious 3-story mansion, as Mr. Bradley had described to Emily. In front of Mason were the remains of a fire-burned-down hut, one of those that one adopts as a barn when one decides to build a real house on a plot, and the plot itself was quite tiny, at most 0.01 acres. Despite the fact that Mason was homeless and had no relevant education, the guy has always been bright-headed. The young man quickly realized that someone had managed to ensure an old hut under the guts of a country mansion in order to then deliberately set a fire and get the due insurance. The homeless man's theory was finally confirmed when he managed to find a witness, an elderly neighbor who told Mason many interesting things. "Yes, son, I saw someone hanging around that hut that night, and not just like that, but with a canister. Who knows, maybe there was a gasoline in it. I didn't see much. I just went out for a smoke. I couldn't sleep." Mason recorded the neighbor's confession on a tape recorder, took some pictures of the burnt mansion, and then went back to Emily. Meanwhile, Emily was again summoned by the director to see how the girl was doing in collecting her debt. "Well, Baker, when are you going to return the money?" Benedict Feldman asked her in a businesslike way. Should I prepare a statement to the police, or do you want to do without it? Emily, on the other hand, decided to go firmly to the end. There will be no police, Mr. Feldman, because I'm not guilty of anything. And now, I'll prove it to you. At that moment, there was a hesitant knock at the door, and a second later, Mason appeared in the doorway. The young man told the director what he had learned, and also laid the pictures of the house on the table in front of him, and let him listen to an audio recording of the neighbor's confession. Feldman thought about it. Now he was ready to believe that one of his best employees might have had nothing to do with such heinous scam. But then who was guilty? Was there a mole in the office? All three of them looked at each other, and Mason answered the question. Look for someone who suddenly has a large sum of money lately. Then the director and Emily remembered that a week ago, the deputy head of the insurance company, Moore, bragged at the top of his voice that he had received a large inheritance from his aunt who lived abroad. Allegedly, the woman had spent the last years of her life in sunny Miami, but she was lonely, and before her death, she decided to bequeath all her fortune to Owen. On Mason's advice, Head Feldman made inquiries about his deputy's life and learned a curious detail. It turns out that the Moore grew up in an orphanage, and the man had no aunt, let alone abroad. This could only mean one thing. It was him who invented the insurance scam, embodying his dirty work with the hands of Emily. Later, it was confirmed during a personal interrogation where, under pressure, Moore opened up and finally confessed what he had done. Bradley, on the other hand, acted as figurehead in the scam. In fact, he worked as an actor in a commercial company that organized practical jokes. According to the plan of the cunning deputy, Emily was to be imprisoned for grand larceny since all the signatures of the insurance payment documents belonged to her. In order to lull the girl's vigilance, he deliberately misled her with his advices, and when the job was done, he quickly distanced himself, blaming everything on the carelessness of the employee. Everything was taken into account in Moore's perfect plan, except for the brainy homeless man who managed to uncover the secret of the burned-down mansion and expose the greedy deputy. Now the deputy director of Feldman and Partners was in jail, and Mason had been hired by the same company in the analytical department. Benedict Feldman concluded that the young man had a natural talent for this kind of thing, so it would be a big mistake to let him go. A year after the event described above, Emily and Mason had a modest but a beautiful wedding. By the way, Rudy, as they called their furry pet, still lives with them, now in their new apartment. The young people often walk with it in the big city park. They're happy, and more often they think about a new addition to their little family. They only have to decide whether Emily should wait until finishes her studies or take a gap year.